And today you find that the Chamber of Commerce, they didn't take very long in doing it, but there's not a brochure that goes out of Billings to a prospective business moving here or people inquiring about moving to Montana, about the fantastic lifestyle that you can access in Billings by the magnificent Beartooth Mountains to the west.
Right. Yes.
So sometimes you get it unexpected bonuses too.
Right.
So it went from being what would have been a hotbed probably of anti-wilderness sentiment, probably even editorializing by the newspapers, to a strong supporter of wilderness, and that is very gratifying to me because we need that kind of a spot. One thing about the Beartooths is that they won't be overrun like, say, the wilderness area of the Mojave Desert, which is so close to 3 or 4 million people in Los Angeles and easy to get to and trying to keep them on roads, etc. The Beartooths are rugged enough that there's a small number of openings, chasms, that are cut into deep rock that you've got pretty good control of who goes up. Now, eventually, people will have to get a number in order to go to their wilderness areas, but at least they'll find something when they get there. It'll be worth the wait.
So how do you enjoy the great outdoors, and how have you enjoyed it through your lifetime?
I think I was born on the run. I was hyperkinetic, the kind of kid that probably would be sedated today with Ritalin and other things. But I grew up on a farm where I could run forever, and I don't think I've ever stopped. And the same thing was true when I became a young teenager to go into the mountains. I'm older now. I just passed my 80th birthday.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
You truly don't look it.
Well, thank you. And I don't feel it either. And I would be doing more of it if I weren't so busy in other things. But I do enjoy getting out. We like to go up to the Woodbine entrance to the Absaroka-Beartooth, up the Stillwater River, just gorgeous up there for walks. That's where the Crippen cabin was located before the Forest Service burned it down.
There's a story there.
There is a story there, and that's a little further along.
So, would you like to talk about one or more individuals who, I'm using some Teddy Roosevelt phrases here, somebody who was in the arena, somebody who fought for the worthy cause of conservation? Any particular anecdotes that you like to tell as far as interesting, fascinating stories that maybe a lot of people don't know about, personal experiences of yours?
This is one where you should have warned me in advance, because after all, in memory. I asked Lee Metcalf one day, we had a softball team, the Mansfield Metcalf softball team, co-ed, that played in the Senate League, kind of cutthroat. And I was giving a ride back to the Capitol after a game, and I said, what got you interested in this? Were you an outdoor type? He said, not really. But I was always interested in the subject matter. I always liked the fact that I was from Montana and these gorgeous mountains, etc. But probably a seminal event for me was, and I'm going to, I think he said I was congressman. I was early. I came home. I was in Helena. I was driving perhaps to Butte. But I was driving along the road, and I looked down off of a bank, and I saw a giant earth-moving piece of equipment down there right in the middle of a small stream. And he was just digging away and stirring up mud and stuff like that, and I stopped the car, and I went down and I said, what are you doing? And the guy immediately said, what's the hell, what is it to you?
I can see that.
And you don't do that. You didn't do that with Lee Metcalf. You just didn't do it. He didn't say whether he explained who he was doing or what he was doing, etc. But he says, I went straight back to Washington, D.C. and put in a bill called SOS. We called it Save Our Streams. And there's an example of the, sort of the conversion toward preservation, stronger and stronger. He had a natural New Deal outlook on life in which business types and bankers and that sort of thing were necessary to the society but needed to have some sort of regulation. And the idea that they could just appropriate public property anytime they wanted to was really bad for him. So that's one story. A couple of others are illustrative, but they involve the kind of language that only Lee was capable of. You get him mad. He was a gentle soul, and he was really a nice person. But you got him mad, and he would let you know it. He was up in the Kalispell area, and that was a time when S393, or the Montana Wilderness Study Act, was controversial. And there was one of the areas up there, and he was at a meeting, and there approached him a person who had been his nemesis for years. And he struck up a conversation with Lee as if he had never ever called him every bad name in the book and that sort of thing. And he stuck out his hand, and Lee says, "I'd rather cut my hand off right to here." And he made a slashing motion to his wrist, and stick it in a bucket of something, then shake hands with you. But I mean, so he could be very, very gracious. And when he held hearings, he could sit for hours and hours and make sure the very last person who had just traveled 2,000 miles got a full say in what he did. I do remember, in addition to being a wilderness supporter, he was the first to champion wild and scenic rivers in Montana. I had just barely gotten to work for him when the Interior Committee in the Senate was starting to move his Wild and Scenic Missouri plan. It had the ranchers terribly stirred up. They, in turn, were either stirring up or were stirred up by BLM, because the Bureau of Land Management controlled the banks, of the river. And it was very, very controversial. It was a done deal because we had the ducks lined up in both the Senate and the House, and the Bureau knew it. But there was an opponent, and he happened to have been the publisher editor of the Lewistown newspaper, who fought it tooth and nail. It was a terrible thing to do. Montanans didn't need a wild and scenic river. Montanans wouldn't use it. It would be all those hippies coming out from the East Coast and getting in their canoes and paddling down, and when they wanted to stop, they'd go up and they would uproot the ranchers' fences and farmhouse fences, etc., for wood so they could have a fire. I mean, all of the terrible things that you can mention. We had a hearing at MSU Billings, at their auditorium there, and Lee was usual gracious self, and he had two more members of Congress with him. The ranchers duly filed up to the podium, knowing that it was a done deal. And they said, "We sure think it's a terrible idea, but if you're going to do it, make sure that BLM runs it." That was their fallback position. When the editor came up, he called Lee a liar.
Whoa.
You don't do that. But Lee, I was proud of him. He didn't even blink. It just passed over him, and the thing became a wild and scenic river. And today it is highly prized by the Lewistown Chamber of Commerce. The business in Fort Benton is up because people want to, float that magnificent stretch of river. as long as I'm talking about the wild scenic river, let me talk about a couple of other things that again escape the public's eye. It's something that the MWA, I don't think, was deeply involved in because it wasn't wilderness. But if you study the history, say, of the Bureau of Land Management, which grew out of the old government land office, when the Dust Bowl era was finally attacked by Franklin Roosevelt, they had to attack the problem of itinerant people using the public lands for grazing, and they did it and they abused it badly. A compromise was that the itinerants would be stopped, but the people who had valid ranches in the area would be given certain preferences to the grazing on those same lands. Out of that grew the notion, and I want to be careful here because there are a lot of very good ranchers, very cooperative, very good citizens and caretakers of the land, but still you had this notion that those public lands were for grazing and that was it. Among the preserves that were created back in the early New Deal days was what is now the Charlie Russell Game Range. As it was set up, it was administered by both the Bureau of Land Management, the newly created BLM, and by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they were co-managers of this range, and the Fish and Wildlife were to be protected and given equal billing. And in time, that was not the case. The ranchers dominated, BLM ran the range, and in effect, Lee threw them off. He went to Floyd Haskell, senator from Colorado, who chaired the appropriate committee for that subject matter. Floyd flew up from Denver. We had the hearing again in Billings, another one of these very contentious, but he was willing to stand for something and move his way through it. He was gracious for the most part, and when he had to be, but he also made bold moves. The game range was ousted, the ranchers ousted BLM, and now it is a game range. That game range, combined with the wild and scenic Missouri River, combined with the monument designation by President Bill Clinton before he left office of the Missouri Breaks Monument, now constitute a sizable piece of land all going in the same direction.
And we do have a small wilderness there, the UL
Yes.
Bend Wilderness.
Yeah. Well, the UL Bend Wilderness is another one. I was there when that passed, and I don't know the details, but I know that after Lee died and later John Melcher went on the committee, he made changes in the UL Bend Wilderness. I think probably create a corridor for people so they could drive their cars closer to the water's edge, etc. But he made a change in it. There was always this necessity to take something that Lee championed and make some change in it, whether it's the rattlesnake in the Missoula area and a corridor which shouldn't have been in there, which at least some of the environmentalists non-affectionately called Melcher's finger, was I think it went back to a small, compact, homogeneous little area outside of Missoula.
Think of interesting personalities and think of the Wilderness Act of 1964. How about, as far as journalists, how about Howard Sonnhauser? Did you know Howard?
I did not know Howard, and unfortunately he died before the passage of the
A
act.
few months before.
But I certainly have read his biography and marveled at his stick-to-itiveness, and he would have been very proud.
He wrote the act. It's a
Sure.
piece of literature.
Yeah.
I've read it. It's really literature.
Yeah.
And it's short.
Yeah, the only problem I have, personally, is that I wish that they had called it something other than wilderness. Because I'm not sure what name I would have given, but the confusion then and now and forever between wilderness with a small w and with a capital W is very great, and it does slow us down. You have to be more of a student of the act itself to know what it is in order to explain the differences, and that slows you down. Those of us who, if you study the history of wilderness, it came about because time after time after time, it took a very long time for people like Bob Marshall and others to convince the agencies themselves to designate protective status. But everybody knew that if the administrations changed, the status could change.
Call them primitive areas.
That's right. Well, there were 3 levels, and the primitive was the highest. And to show how important that was, when the Wilderness Act was passed, the only instant wilderness it created were those already being administered as instant by the Forest Service. BLM came later, Park Service, other agencies. But the primitive areas were automatically included. I feel that today's wilderness people, including in the wilderness MWA chapters, certainly speaking for the Eastern Wildlands chapter here in Billings, and I mean no criticism of the individuals. They're very fine people and all of those. They're working toward good goals, but they don't know what wilderness with a capital W is. I'm not sure how many fairly rigorous tests of the act, which is not all that long, and hey, it's the subject matter that we all care about. I'm not sure how many of them could pass such an exam. But if you were a vacuum salesman, you would want to know your product through and through, and you'd want to sharpen and hone the arguments in favor of it. And we lack that. So if you run into an ATV person in the bar who's telling his colleagues that you cannot do this in a wilderness area and you cannot do that, you're so much more effective in defense of your product if you know those things. So one of the things that makes it extremely different is wilderness with a capital W. I never have promoted anything else or even raised this issue, to be honest. I don't know if it would be possible to change it, but it would make our life a lot easier. We would get more wilderness because whatever the new name is, you start associating that with those pleasant places in the Beartooths and those pleasant places in the Bob Marshall and those whatever. And otherwise people go, oh yeah, wilderness. I got a wilderness right outside my cabin. Yeah, with a small W.
Right. Speaking of the Wilderness Act era and strong, interesting personalities, being in D.C., Stuart Brandborg.
Yes.
Did you get to know him well?
Not bad, not too bad. Stuart was the gentleman's gentleman. He was very knowledgeable. He was passionate for everybody, and he was well placed by being head of the Montana Wilderness or the Wilderness Society. And it had more clout because wilderness was up then. It's down now. I wish that he or somebody like him could have continued.
I think under his leadership, he took over essentially right at the time of the Wilderness Act passage. He really changed the direction of the Wilderness Society to wanting to start up regional and local chapters and offices. It's overused now, I'm afraid, these days, but grassroots organization, get boots on the ground more locally.
Well, he had
get out of the DC mindset.
He had this great advantage that he came out of a wilderness battleground, clear cutting, all that sort of thing.
Montana, Idaho.
Yeah, in a state that had the first wilderness grassroots citizens organization in America. So I mean, he understood that it worked here and it can work elsewhere. There are certain principles that can be applied elsewhere.
He's a scientist. He's a forester.
Yep.
He comes from a long lineage of foresters just in his own personal family background.
Yeah, one of the things that Montanans, especially newcomers and young people who come into the movement, need to be told is how intimately Montanans have been involved in the national wilderness movement, the Bob Marshalls and others.
Right. So don't be bashful here. What are the personal accomplishments that you are proud of and you would like to discuss with us today?
Are you talking about the wilderness? Or can I
well,
roam rather widely?
Yeah, you can roam widely. Maybe think about conservation issues.
No, I'm gonna start with conservation issues. Then I'm going to veer off in something totally unexpected, but shut me off if I go too far.
I'm listening.
Yeah. Okay. I'm proud for having walked the conservation walk that I was permitted to take in my lifetime. I really am proud that even though I was in the Beartooths as a teenager, back out, I'm Montana, I write a paper on the Wilderness Act, I'm back out, I bounce around, I come to rest in the office of somebody who was so extraordinary, not just for the wilderness part, but I mean a person who of rectitude and brilliance and etc. And I'm not a hero worshiper. People who know me, I mean, I happen to have, you can see in this room here, a picture of Lee Metcalf and a picture of Mike Mansfield. Neither is inscribed to me. I don't collect those things, etc. They're basically my memory. And I was privileged later to work for a congressman named John Seiberling of Ohio. After Lee died, I stayed on to work for his immediate successor, Paul Hatfield of Great Falls, whom I thought would have been a terrific senator. Another year with Max Baucus. So I know how these individuals work. I go downtown to take care of my family, to have a job, and I ended up in BLM of all places, and I ended up there when James Watt came into power. And I had a job that was fairly close to him where I could watch him. But it was wearing awfully thin, and I didn't figure I was going to last all that much more. I get a call from an individual named Harry Crandall, who used to work for the Wilderness Society, and unbeknownst to me, he had gone on to that same subcommittee where John Melcher had been chairman. So he was subcommittee director for John Seiberling of Ohio. John Seiberling of Ohio, I found out, he offered me the job as staff director there, so I was back involved in wilderness. Something I forgot to say in my wanderings.
Mm-hmm.
Seiberling, if people could do any research on him, was so much a clone of Lee Metcalf, it just was not funny. I mean, just very, very upright, honest, great sense of humor, but a great sense of history. He came from the Seiberling rubber family. He had the name but none of the income. You know, he wasn't rich. He came out of Akron, Ohio, and he made his name in preservation by championing and eventually getting a Cuyahoga National Park. I believe it's strictly a national park between Cleveland and Akron. And he was a very strong advocate of wilderness. And in some way, he was the father of the Alaska National Lands Act. It was his staffer that did most of the writing of that act, and the chairman of the committee was Mo Udall, who was in poor health and had Parkinson's badly. And they made the decision to have hearings around the country because the national lands of Alaska belonged to the nation. So they held hearings in everywhere from Atlanta to Seattle. And John Seiberling was the chair of all those hearings, to the point that Mo Udall called him Old Iron Pants, because he could sit for hours and hours and always a gentleman. My first hearing with him was unexpectedly the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem did not exist except in the minds of the people who championed it. I mean, it was not called that by anybody. And so John had 2-day hearings where Montanans paraded back, and other people too, to champion the creation of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, at least the concept. From the very first opening gavel, and for the first day, there was this particular congressman who kept standing up and objecting. I object. There is no such thing as a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Stop calling it a yellow ecosystem. By the second day, he was beaten down and he shut up. It was Dick Cheney, congressman from Wyoming, and he was very, very unhappy. But eventually, out of our little subcommittee came the packet. A special Library of Congress report on the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which gave it great credence and great credibility. So I worked for Mike Mansfield, I worked for Lee Metcalf, and I worked for John Seiberling, and I never asked for any of the jobs. They just came out of the blue. I'm probably as proud of that as of anything else that I did in Washington.
And they wanted you to work for them because they knew you were good and you were effective.
I really tried to be efficient, effective, and a good staffer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're talking about legislation, democracy, we're talking about conservation, and the reality is this is a democracy. For something that we believe in, you need to develop and maintain a constituency. So I'd like to ask you now, and a lot of this is now looking forward, not really historical here for a moment in view. Your thoughts, recommendations, and ideas about where we go from here with the generations to follow, about how to reach out to them, to develop constituencies and to get these kids out in the woods, loving the woods, willing to fight for it, not just on a superficial level responding to a poll question, but to go out there and join groups, to write letters to their representatives, and to work for the future of, frankly, more wilderness.
That's a big order. We have so many other problems in the country today demanding our attention and our hard work and our donor dollars, and we work increasingly in a certain atmosphere of media, in which the media is more and more oriented toward TV, and the print journalism you have left is, in many ways, to those of us who work for real newspapers, becoming an endangered species.
Investigative journalism.
That's right. Investigative journalism or relative journalism. So that today, and I will be speaking out of school, but I happen to live in a community of chain journalism, and I lived in it before the current chain. The Anaconda Copper Company owned every daily newspaper in Montana except one. We not only did not know what was happening in Helena at the legislature, because the news was selectively given to us, we didn't know what was happening in City Hall in Billings. So, I mean, this is the kind of blanket, and the blanket has never left. What it has is a nicer face. There's some extraordinarily good writers, let's say on my local paper, very good. But still, you open up, and this is I'll make a categorical statement here, which is not greatly accurate, but more or less. You open up a section A, a B, a C, and a D, and you'll find 2 bylines in each. more or less. The rest of it is filler. It's either AP or it's pulled off the, used to be pulled off the ticker tape, and run. And too much of the function of a newspaper is to put stuff in what's called the news hole, and then fill everything around it with advertising dollars. And one of the ways that you save money and help the bottom line is not to hire people, because people are costly. And then the people you do hire, you don't permit them to wander too far off of some sort of reservation. And so the question that you asked has to be put in the context of a situation whereby every radio station in Montana is out-of-state owned. Every television station in Montana is out-of-state owned. Every newspaper of note in Montana is out-of-state owned. So if these people do not believe in Montana, do not come out of that element, do not really champion that particular element, how do the people in, say, MWA break through? They're going to have to use the new digital methods of communication to the extent that they can. I attempted to move, right, made a proposal to the Eastern Wildlands chapter many years ago that really didn't find resonance. It was decent here, but not in Helena, so I've never said much about it. And I could make a proposal that one of the things that MWA can control is the knowledge and then observe the fervor, etc., of their own membership. They have to use their own membership in order to get most of this message out. Mm-hmm. The other giant force affecting institutions, organizations, are the foundations. There was a time when you could write a letter to your congressman and the person would see it, and you'd have some sort of influence.
Mike Mansfield used to open up letters to him himself.
Oh yeah, yeah. Or if he didn't, somebody, say Ray Dockstader, who was from Terry, Montana, and was his was his legislative assistant. They may write the letter and he'd okay it, sign it, and then he'd PS the stuff that was left out. Mm-hmm. And he used a pen with a nib, a point that was so wide that you practically think you're using today's magic marker. But foundation money is critical. So you used to be able to write to Congress, and you had pretty good chance of getting a response and making contact, and he knew the pulse of the people. But the times have changed, and the population that an individual has to serve has grown so great, and the number of hours per week that the individual in office has to sit down and dial for dollars and pay attention to the number of millions of dollars it needs. I mean, it just is an impossible task. So out of this effort grew Sierra clubs and wilderness societies, and others will do the talking for you. So you find one of those and you utilize your pressure there. But the foundations are still really important, because whether it's the Pew Foundation or others, and I'm not sure who funds MWA, these people have their own experts internal, and they have their own idea of what policy ought to be. And so they say, well, you can have the money if you go in this direction. So you're never quite sure, and I'm not talking to MWA, I'm talking about organizations generally that rely heavily on foundation money. The foundations are doing as much. I mean, look at the educational movement today. 3 massive foundations: Bill Gates, Walton family, and the Broad family. And they are driving education in certain directions that would not go, probably, if I'm quite sure, if otherwise. So I would say that in Montana, judicious use of foundation money and membership money, etc., for slick brochures and nice visuals, etc., and some persuasive arguments. But otherwise, if they could somehow charge up their own membership, and I have I have a proposal that they could do it, that incrementally at least you could make it a more efficient organization for getting the word out.
I think one of the real great programs of the MWA, and it's now in our 51st year, is the Wilderness Walks program.
Great
for members and non-members, getting them outdoors, hikes of all degrees of physical challenge, and it's really broad-based, and I'm really struck by with tabling and so on events that I've been at.
No, it's a great program.
It's a great real program. Strong, broad
but
recognition.
But way back when they started that, they had it was started, I mean, probably before I came to town. But that's one place where I said, with trying to promote Lee Metcalf, not as a nostalgic thing in any way, but because he was respected for the right reasons. Why don't we have his picture on the inside cover of Wilderness Walks? Yeah. Anything to start introducing this person who is truly our hero. And I even proposed giving a Lee Metcalf Award every year for public service that promotes preservation, etc., but not in those years in which nobody did anything. Don't give them to members of Congress unless they do something extraordinarily out of the ordinary. It might be a city councilman in some small town on the High Line who fought hard to preserve a portion of a public park up there, or it might be something else. So I'm saying you could use Lee Metcalf in that sense, an award which I suppose I could even find some of the old papers, but the time wasn't right and it didn't go very far. But to me, I still think that energizing the starting with their own chapters and the people who work in Helena to be as knowledgeable as possible about what wilderness is, what the Act says, etc., and then have that radiate out, give it a try, and see whether you can whether it makes a difference. I think it would make a difference.
You talked about this before, and they asked you about just focusing on the Wilderness Act as literature and people knowing about what's in the Act. We all know about the fabulous word untrammeled.
Right.
And what would you say as far as the people, to the audience here today, to people watching, as far as the heart of the matter with the Wilderness Act that maybe a lot of people, even in a conservation audience, are not aware of, that you feel strongly they should know?
Well, I'm going to deviate just a little bit.
Okay.
When the Wilderness Act was passed and we championed wilderness, it was a case of being purer than Caesar's wife. That we interpreted the act because we had to. There were no court cases yet. The industry was promoting their own version of it, and in order for us to it was a fairly new product even in Congress, and for us to move a piece of wilderness through Congress, we had to exclude every old partially grown over road, any mark of man. It was just incredibly tightly interpreted. And it led to some very serious problems, and probably led Lee to some aspects of promoting wilderness where we lost some acreage. But the real tragedy was the act, in effect, gave the Forest Service 10 years in which to inventory all of their lands. It says those that qualify you will, in effect, endorse. You will send that recommendation to the Congress. A great tragedy was that the work of Lyndon Johnson and his Wilderness Act, among other acts, was cut short by the election of Richard Nixon. Had he not been president, we would have had a minimum of 4 more years in which to consolidate everything from the Wilderness Act to the what I want to say, the getting more and more minority people into positions. As it was, there's an extraordinary number of people just in a very few years before Nixon shut the door on it, were moved up, their station in life improved. Well, what did they do under the Nixon administration? And he had essentially 8 years because Gerald Ford finished his term. He waited until the 8th year of the Wilderness Act before they started doing the inventorying. In the interim, and of course without fanfare, and you're not going to find any examples of this, but we are quite convinced of it, those of us who are watching it closely, was the agencies were to, in effect, do unofficial things. And if you found a huge area that was pretty much homogeneous and would be perfect wilderness area, but it had a substandard something somewhere in there, they would find some way to develop it or to cut it or do something, and therefore destroy the homogeneity of the area. There was whole lots of areas that were compromised or destroyed from ever being nominated for wilderness. And by the time that after the 8th year, they came up with their recommendations, and when they came to Congress, they were minimal. So it was a terrible loss. And you'll have to remind me again of your original question there.
About your comments earlier that you touched on here today, both on and off screen, about people in the realm of conservation.
Oh, okay.
And subset of people in the realm of the Montana Wilderness Association.
I think they ought
really knowing
yeah.
the Wilderness Act.
They ought to. This is the kind of side stories that tell you how much that we actually lost. And one of the things that we learn out of that is that the purity for purity's sake was misplaced. Today you can have wilderness areas that are tiny.
5,000 acres.
Yeah, you can have wilderness areas that have old growth in them. You can have wilderness areas that have reclaimed roads. So this is what I would tell people, that when they read it in a macro sense for the poetry of it and the ideological descriptive nature of it, of what we hope to have, etc. But don't be mesmerized by the words that might keep you from. If you find an area and you think it's another one is that we were beaten over the head, and we still are. That why should that be wilderness? There's no beauty there. They should know that the word beauty is not in the Wilderness Act. That's a subjective thing that everybody brings to it. It has nothing to do with the Wilderness Act. And when you think of beauty, you think of snow-capped peaks, and you think of deep trees and beautiful mountain streams. But we now have, the Mojave Desert, about 6 million acres, is wilderness.
UL Bend Wilderness,
yeah.
Medicine Lake Wilderness,
yeah.
Hopefully Bitter Creek, Terry Badlands.
Medicine Lake was in the S393.
Right.
Yeah. So I've not read the Wilderness Act, for refresher, and I should have done that before you came in. I'm sure that other things will occur to me, but they'd be fairly minor. I think I would let people ask people to realize what a revolutionary document it is when you consider the long history of despoiling the lands as they came. We took them away from people that lived there. We expropriated for our own use. I think that people who deal in wilderness, because we're talking about the end product, ought to be steeped in some American history. If you were asked somebody, what are public lands? Most people wouldn't know exactly. Well, they're the lands out there. Who administers BLM? Where did it come from? Darn if I know.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, but if you go all the way back, and look at the founding colonies, 13 colonies. Some were on the East Coast and they were landlocked. Some were on the west end, like Virginia, and they were pointed toward the Pacific. And one of the compromises, the Maryland Compromise, which is a little landlocked state, says we are not going to join unless there are finite boundaries, the boundaries of today imposed on these various. So in effect, Virginia drew its line, well actually drew a line around West Virginia. West Virginia eventually separated from Virginia. And other states, so that when the central government came into being, it inherited lands of indeterminate nature and size west of its own boundaries. All of a sudden it was in the public land business because some of those lands were not being challenged by the Brits. That was more up along the Canadian border. They were not being challenged by the Spaniards. You had to go quite a ways before you got to the Louisiana Purchase and the general outlines of the old Spanish lands, etc. So it was understood that in the interim, the central government of the United States was going to have all this land. What did they do with the land? They started giving it away. They gave it away. They gave land to Revolutionary War pensioners. They gave it to settlers, the true settlers, not until Abraham Lincoln, but they were still giving away and giving and giving and giving to the railroads and etc., until they reached a point where they couldn't give any more away. This is what public don't understand. In the Sagebrush Rebellion in Nevada, which is 90% federally owned, oh, they rail like the devil. Whenever any state was created, there were federal lands that were retained. The states got a generous supply, mostly in the nature of school lands, etc. In Nevada, the people who ran the state basically gave away the state lands till they don't have state lands in Nevada. So people should understand these. It reached a point, especially in the Depression era, when there were no takers for public lands.
Cheap.
Not well. It was beyond cheap. There were no takers. There were not. People were no longer homesteading, because why go out and take 120 acres in Dust Bowl, Montana, or Colorado, or whatever? They just were not. They were not taking the land. In fact, land reverted back to the federal government. They had what they call the O and C lands in Oregon. A very, very large patch was given back to the federal government. And when you find the federal government pretty much gave away every acre west of the Mississippi. I mean, that's all they had left, put it that way. They gave every acre east of the Mississippi. And yet today you'll find federal enclaves and you'll find little federal forests and that sort of thing. Those are lands that reverted back to the federal government for failure of who knows what, not being maintained, not taxes being paid on, or whatever. So the people who challenge the local takeover of public lands don't understand that we would have given them these lands probably if they had been wanted. The cattlemen and the loggers and stuff didn't want lands that they had to pay for, pay taxes on, do all this sort of thing. If they could just go ahead and invade quietly under cover of darkness or subterfuge, lands that they could cut, grass they could graze. People don't realize that most of the money in the West was British investment money, or Scottish, and elsewhere, but those are the biggies. And that those cattle herds that came up from Texas were largely investor owned, and they would go through these valleys and all that free grass and then onto railroad cars and right to Chicago to be slaughtered. There were instances, many of them, of where investors would have a sizable supply of lambs. They'd put them in railroad cars and they'd run them out across the West. And when they got to something that was promising, they let down the ramps and all those lambs would go out and several sheep herders and their dogs, and that was it. And they would have a rendezvous point marked out for some day in September or before the snows came. All those big healthy sheep would come right back and right up onto the thing, and and in effect, why would you want to buy the lands or homestead the lands or something like that if you could get all of that stuff for free? So all of these things play into the history. So if you want to understand wilderness and why is wilderness land, well, don't you have enough? It's the end product of all of that basic wastage. And so when you get in an argument with somebody who's promoting the Sagebrush Rebellion, you've got some facts that other people don't have, and that has to help your argument.
In my home state of Tennessee, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, those lands had all been logged, secondary growth, and it was private lands.
Yeah.
And it was bought up during the Great Depression when land was cheap. Nobody really wanted it,
sure.
as you talk about. And it was bought up by fundraising in schools and churches, private money, a lot of it, to actually get that done.
Okay.
And now it's a wonderful national park, public lands.
Well, we have a long and checkered history, and judging by the political situation today, it's going to continue to be checkered for a while. So, any question about how do you involve young people? It's and have more effectiveness. It's the young people who use if you can generate and energize your own chapters and your own staff, etc., it will change how you handle young people. And the young people bring with them the technology.
And the energy.
Yeah, they've got it. And I will say to MWA's credit today, they have a budding youth movement. And they've got a director, Zach, and I'm going... Porter.
The
Zach
Next
Porter.
Gen program, which is
Yeah,
essential.
and I like him a lot. And he and I have talked about things that they might do. And I think it's possible, but some money would have to go into it. And I could craft with Zach a program where I guarantee you that you'd have really good feedback, but I don't know if people would like the idea or put the money into it.
Let's do it, because I think that I really envision with these interviews of you and others, young people who like history, watch these, and they'll be motivated, become enthusiastic, and work for wilderness and wild places. And that's what we need. And it's also a public health issue from my background as a physician.
Yep.
Getting these kids out walking is great as far as for lifetime public health.
Yep.
And individual health.
And we need more and more champions, more and more advocates, because there's not that much left comparatively, except in Alaska, because so many precious parts were gone. And they were gone because the Wilderness Act and its mandate to the Forest Service to inventory and send recommendations to the Hill was torpedoed. It really is sad.